State of the World Population Report has revealed that nearly 50% of global pregnancies are unintended. The United Nations Population Fund Regional Director, Dr. Bennett Nyanabangi, says that 65% of pregnancies were unplanned between 2015 and 2019 in southern Africa. Of those, 36% were terminated.
This report focused on the issue of unintended pregnancies and their consequences. The report found out that nearly 50% of all pregnancies in the world, which is about 121 million pregnancies each year, are unintended. And therefore, the title of the report is Seeing the Unseen, because this is a crisis which actually people don't see and don't talk about. Coming back closer to our region, if you look at Southern Africa, we have 65% of pregnancies that happened between 2015 and 2019 being unintended, and 36% of them ended in abortion. If we look at the other side, East Africa, here we had 47% of the pregnancies unintended, and half ended in abortion. So really, it's a crisis, and it's unseen, and it's not talked about, and it affects even more the young people.
We've been reporting for much of this weekend about protests in the United States, both by pro-choice and anti-abortion activists in the United States, who were all reacting to a decision by the country's Supreme Court, which on Friday repealed the Roe versus Wade historic judgment, which allowed women the right to have abortions performed. Let's speak about this now with Sanusha Naidu, a senior researcher with the Institute for Global Dialogue. Sanusha, welcome to the program. So the United States often positions itself as a country that is democratic, that is advanced in thought, and when it comes to the rights of all forms of people, all sorts of people. How then do you explain this judgment?
Good afternoon, Tembikile, and good afternoon to your viewers. I don't think anybody can actually understand this. I mean, I guess the people who made the judgment in terms of the Supreme Court justices who made the decision to overturn an almost 50-year legal precedent and law that protects a woman's rights in terms of the choice that they can make with regard to their pregnancy, etc. They're only ones that can actually explain it in the context of where the majority ruling was penned by the Justice Alto, which said that, it was damaging. And of course, the minority judgment was that saying that it was actually damaging for all the wrong reasons. So I think in the end of the day, the challenge is really around how much does the ideological bent in the U.S. take precedent over the kind of civil liberties, freedoms enshrined in their constitution, but also in terms of minority rights and civil liberties for minority groups in the country, particularly in terms of is it enshrined in the constitution as an equal rights approach? And what we saw over the weekend, I think, what we saw over the weekend was still a shock, but there was a leaked version of this ruling that came out, that there was speculation that this was going to happen, that the justices were going to vote in majority to rescind this Roe versus Wade decision that was made in 1973. And of course, when you look at the polling, the popular support in terms of the Roe versus Wade or the Wade ruling, you got about a 61% popular opinion poll supporting it, and about a 36% or thereabouts actually supporting the justices' majority ruling. So I think what it does say to you as well is that we're seeing a regression in terms of the idea that certain rights are protected and certain rights are not. Certain civil liberties and freedoms are being interpreted in a very kind of narrow prism. And I think the implications of that is when we start to see this kind of ideological bent become much more on the political spectrum right wing, or however you want to interpret it, but conservative in the most bizarre way, but in the most parochial way, but also in the most extreme way.
So the judgment, or the ruling, I should say, by the Supreme Court in America wasn't entirely surprising, as you say, because there was that leak a few months ago, and people got a sense that this was the way in which it was going to go. But part of it has to do, doesn't it, with the fact that majority of the judges on the Supreme Court in the U.S. are Republican, and Republicans have for years campaigned on an anti-abortion slate, shall we say. How much of an issue is the appointment of judges to the Supreme Court are largely based on ideological and political leaning.
Yeah, I mean, if you listen to President Biden's response to the ruling, he actually makes the statement in his briefing to the press that it was actually Donald Trump's appointment and the legacy of Donald Trump in terms of appointing 3 of the justices that have now shifted the Supreme Court, towards this kind of very right-wing spectrum in terms of interpretation. The other analysis coming through on this is that this is where the Republicans have been able to gain traction in terms of what their presence and the way that they've been managed to create that presence on the Supreme Court, what they haven't been able to do in law. Let me give you this Roe versus Wade judgment is such a paradox in terms of the fact that the same Supreme Court a few days prior or several days prior had ruled that the New York state could not determine the limitation of people carrying handguns. So you can see this contradiction in terms of the way in which the interpretation of the Republican Party and the more conservative elements, because let's be honest, not all in the Republican Party may support this, but in the broader context of it, that there's a sense that they are moving legislation in terms of how the separation of powers between the executive, legislature, and the judiciary is now playing into this kind of role that the judiciary is taking in litigating on critical issues that are entrenched and enshrined in the Constitution in terms of First Amendment rights and so forth. But of course, the challenge is now how are you going to deal with other minority issues? So the LGBT community is now on alert. The question of minority groups that may have particular civil liberties, Black Lives Matter is on the alert. So you've got this incredible rumble that's actually, in a way, kind of unraveled the democratic system in the U.S.
Right. So President Joe Biden then, in his vow to protect the rights of women who want to get abortions performed for whatever reason, said that they need to now make abortion an issue for the ballot, basically. When voting happens in local elections at the end of this year, he's emphasized that people need to elect more Democrat lawmakers, right? Is that the solution?
Well, at the end of the day, you know how the election process works in the U.S. I mean, it's banking on the congressional votes that are the election that's going to happen in November is going to be a big thing for the Democrats to go out and really lobby in terms of making sure that they are able to retain control of both houses. If not, they can't do it by a simple margin. They've got to do it by a big margin. And of course, the challenge is also the question of how much the Republicans want to actually then utilize the space in terms of those that actually see Roe versus Wade as an infringement of the right to life. The other thing I think is important is those justices are going to remain on the Supreme Court benches for a bit. And so even if you do have to have the kind of pushing this issue as Roe is a ballot on the ballot, and so is the right to women's rights is on the ballot. The question is, how much will that influence those that are coming out to vote? We saw how it happened in the election for the presidential house in terms of Trump versus Biden. But remember, Trump lost by 3 million votes, and he was still quite the highest level of losing the popular vote as well. So it tends to tell you that it's not easily going to be done unless the Democrats go out from now till before November and really showcase what they need to do. And just a final point on this, I think what's also very critical as well is to what extent does the judiciary then in the U.S. kind of in the federal system is the final arbiter of issues.
A final question then, globally, the United States is very influential. There's no denying that. Could this ruling embolden other governments in other parts of the world then to also ban abortion and leave people with very little choice if, for example, U.S. organizations that would normally help with sexual and reproductive health care, i.e. or including abortions, are now forced to also withdraw their funds?
Yeah, I mean, the implications of this beyond the U.S. is quite staggering. So for one, it definitely emboldens those very conservative right-wing governments who actually believe that these issues are essentially liberties that should not be guaranteed to women and should actually then be controlled by the state. So there's gatekeeping, but there's also the infringement of your civil liberties. So it definitely will give that level of snowballing effect. On those NGOs that rely on funding from the US, I will be interesting to see what this ruling does in terms of impact on that funding that comes through the US for reproductive rights, for the education of women in terms of their civil liberties, in terms of the kinds of educational support and development engagements that happen. Thirdly, I think what's very important as well is that we now realize that the standard on human rights has dropped fundamentally, that the question of upholding the human rights approach is now being challenged by the very nature of the fact that more than 50% of the world's population, which are women, are facing vulnerability.
Sanusha Naidu, always good to speak to you. Thank you very much for being with us today.